There are a lot of VR games that have released over the years. Some of them sell well, but most don't. In this video, I want to go over the different elements of VR game design and marketing, and give my thoughts on what makes a game successful and what doesn't. I'll talk about some game-specific gameplay elements later, like gunplay and hand interaction, and whilst that stuff's really important in how a game feels to play, first you have to get people to actually buy the game, or even just spend the time to try it. Even if you put out a demo, trying to get people to download something for free and give it a try can be a challenge, because the truth is that gamers not only have a limited amount of money, but also free time. And we don't want to waste that time doing things that we probably won't enjoy. So to sell a game, first you need to get people to want to play it. This is partly down to the marketing, which is something that most developers don't do well, whether this is down to limited budget and time, or just not really knowing how to market the game in a way people will engage with it. But the game itself needs to be marketable. The best marketing in the world won't help much if your game isn't particularly that interesting to people in the first place. Very early on in development, developers need to figure out their unique selling point. This is the thing that sets them out from the rest of the competition, and it gets people's interest. Some examples of this would be games like Hubris and Red Matter 2, whose USP are its excellent graphics. They are focused on creating visually stunning and interesting sci-fi worlds that just watching a video makes you want to check it out and see it in the headset. Games like Bone Lab and Blade and Sorcery are focused on physics and giving the player a playground to mess around with them. You've got games like Gorilla Tag and Windlands 2, which are focused on using interesting movement mechanics that make the game look fun even without playing it. The reality is, before someone even thinks about trying a new VR game, they watch a trailer or some gameplay footage through social media, so your game needs to capture people's interest on a 2D screen before they can even try it out in virtual reality. It's also important to know your limitations, whether it's the size and budget of your game studio or your experience and abilities. It's all well and good saying you want to create Grand Theft Auto in VR, but these big AAA games take hundreds of developers, multiple years, and they cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make. The Until You Fall developers Shell Games did a talk at JDC, and one of the big focuses of the talk was making a VR game on a budget. When they were figuring out what game to make, they experimented with many different gameplay mechanics. The initial plan was to make a fully featured VR dungeon crawler with looting, consumables, weapon holsters, climbing, and many more gameplay elements. They said that whilst they could have added all these things, to do them in a polished way was making the game more and more complicated, and ultimately taking more and more time, which is obviously money, especially when you've got wages to pay. They decided to really focus on the core elements of the gameplay, which was the combat. So they focused all the attention on the meat of the gameplay, removing elements that they felt were distractions and would potentially cause issues with the overall scope of the game. A game that released recently, which I feel was overambitious, was Lon, a cyberpunk-style adventure shooter. Rather than making more linear levels you progress through, they made a large hub area which was in a city with stores and people walking around. But the game was made by 3 people and they just couldn't pull it off. You can see people literally just walking around in circles, and they have this weird, strange walk pattern where they walk a few steps and then they stop, and then they walk a few more. It just ends up looking a bit poor and it cheapens the overall feel of the game. I don't personally feel it was worth the time and effort that they put into it, and they would have been better off saving that time and putting it into other areas of the game. So developers need to think about the unique selling point of the game and make sure that they're realistic with the scope of the project based on the size and budget of the studio. Here are some of the things that I think personally are really important when making a VR game and should be considered a priority for developers from very early on. Visuals are important. There's no real way of getting around it. We buy with our eyes, and if a game looks bland and generic, then why would anyone want to bother with it? This doesn't mean that a game needs to have high-end graphics and try to be as photorealistic as possible. You have to build a game based on the hardware you're making it for. So if you're making a quest game, if you try to go for realistic visuals, unless you've got an incredibly talented team who can optimize games really well, like with Red Matter 2 developers, then your game's going to end up looking bad. Bone Lab is a good example of a game that has its own unique identity with a more realistic look to it, rather than something stylized, but it's been built and designed in a way that it can still run on the Quest. The game uses a grid-based look to it, and the entire lore of the game is that you're in a simulation. This gives the developers the freedom to make things look more simplistic and more blocky level design, whilst also giving the game a unique look that is instantly recognisable. It's got interesting enemies like the nodes, crablets and the roller dudes, and overall it's a smart design. Until You Fall, which I mentioned earlier, is another game with a striking and unique art style, with really bright, almost neon colours with contrasting backgrounds. You've got glowing skin and incredible art for the armour and overall enemy design. Lies Beneath is a fantastic looking survival horror game with a comic book style look to it. They use the dark and heavy fog to reduce the draw distance down so that they can cram more in front of you on the quest. Obviously I don't want every game to have to go down this route, but these are some examples of VR games that have really unique, striking and smart visual art design that makes them look good and instantly recognisable. If you're a small studio who is good at coding but not very good at art, then try to get someone that is on the project, because without your own look and style, then you may as well not bother. AI is also a really good tool for giving you the ability to take an idea and churn out different iterations quickly to try out and create something that will make your game stand out on a 2D screen. So what about gameplay? Gameplay is equally as important. You need to make sure that your game has got a really good primary gameplay loop. This is the moment-to-moment gameplay that the player will be doing throughout the game. This is obviously going to vary massively depending on the type of game that you're making. Puzzle games, for example, are very hard to market unless you've got something that really stands out. Some of the most popular puzzle games out of VR are the ones that have got a unique and interesting puzzle gameplay mechanic that looks fun to play with. Games like Portal, the Entropy Center, and the recent Viewfinder game, where you take pictures and then use the Polaroid to create new objects in the real world. These games have all got a really good primary gameplay loop, and if you look at some footage, you instantly understand what you're going to be doing as a player. One thing I really hate, and we see this more in non-VR games, are trailers where they choose swooping camera angles, pre-rendered cutscenes, and if you're lucky, a tiny bit of actual gameplay. You end up walking away not really sure what the gameplay is going to be like. Some VR games that have got a really good gameplay loop are Beat Saber. You only have to watch the footage for a few seconds to understand what the game is about and what you're actually going to be doing as a player. And you pair that with its own simple yet distinctive art style, which goes back to my previous comments, and you've got a hit. I think a VR developer that's really good at this are Joyway. They've released a few VR games now, including Stride, a parkour Mirror's Edge clone. It's got a really clean look to it, and they've done an amazing job of capturing footage of gameplay that really shows what the game is about and made it look cool. They also made Against, which is another rhythm game that launched into a very crowded market. It's a cross between Beat Saber and Pistol Whip, but they made it their own and it's got a really interesting film noir style, which is very distinctive. I do think they release too many games and don't finish them, but I can't fault the creativity, and they know how to make a game look good, and I'm really looking forward to the story mode for Stride in the future. Capturing good footage is also really important. I know it's probably not a priority for most developers, but good spectator cams can go a long way, because when influencers start making videos about your game, the better it looks on YouTube or TikTok, the more people will want to play it. Undead Citadel is a recent example of a game with a good spectator cam. They added some stabilisation to the head movement so it isn't so jerky, a slightly wider field of view, and a little motion blur, and it really makes the game look better. Another thing I want to talk about are arms in VR. Most games have floating hands. Personally, when I'm in VR, it doesn't really bother me that much, and I know that some people don't like having full arms because they don't perfectly match up with the real life ones. I also don't think a full body is needed personally, as that does end up getting in the way too much, but I think having arms with some good inverse kinematics can improve the look and feel of a game, not just from inside the headset, but more importantly, again, from a 2D video recording perspective. You really notice floating hands when you're watching footage, when you're not actually in the headset playing, and having arms can just really enhance video footage. Contractors has an option to turn the in-game body and arms off, which I do think should be an option, but look at the difference it makes when watching back this footage. It just looks so much better from a viewer's perspective, and again, we buy games based on what we see in a 2D video, so the more that you can do to make your game look appealing to players, the better. So let's finish up by talking about some more specific gameplay elements, because once you've convinced someone to buy a game, now you need to hold their attention and make a game they enjoy. Otherwise, they'll just refund it, and you end up with bad reviews, and no matter how good a game looks in a YouTube video, it won't save a bad game. If you're making a VR shooter, then you need to make sure that the guns feel good to handle. I've made a separate video just going over gun handling in VR, so watch that for a more in-depth look. But the main thing is making sure that guns have got a good feeling of power. There's nothing worse than guns in VR that feel weak. To make guns feel powerful, you need to make sure that they have some kick when fired. Even if it doesn't affect the actual aim of the gun, having the gun move when fired is important. The amount of shots an enemy can take to kill can also impact this, but that's going to vary depending on the style of game that you're trying to create. Gun sounds are also important. Making sure that a game has a satisfying noise can really help make them more enjoyable to use. VR specific guns is also something I've talked about before and made a separate video on. I'll put a link in the description to these videos, but I've said it a few times that I don't feel enough developers make use of VR. Vertigo 2 is a perfect example of a game that has a lot of thought put into each gun in the game, and they've made sure that each one has its place and they have interesting reload mechanics, giving them all their own character. I also think that enemy variety is important. Too many games just have the same few enemies in a game, and they all die by you just pumping bullets into them. Having a few different enemies with their own movesets and attack patterns, maybe some of them have armour that you need to remove or weak spots that you can shoot to make them easier to kill. Hand interaction is something that is very difficult to get right. Half-Life Alyx is the masterclass at this, with very little jank, multiple hand poses for each object, and contextual hand movement, so when your hand goes near to an object, the hand pose will change to smooth out the transition from open hand to holding something. The problem is, most developers aren't going to be able to get close to that, because making something at this level of detail and polish is incredibly difficult and time consuming. Creating a good system to pick up objects from a distance is essential. Even in Half-Life Alyx, once you get the gravity gloves, you rarely have to pick something up directly, and I would personally design games and anything that needs picking up to be done at a distance. I like Half-Life Alyx and Bone Lab's approach, where you need to press the trigger to lock onto the object rather than just pressing the grip, as this stops you accidentally picking up the wrong item by mistake. If you want to have the player loot, then try to avoid any sort of chests where the player has to bend down to pick something up. In Undead Citadel, you've got chests where you have to bend over to open them, and it can be a real pain in the arse to get them to stay open. Propagation Paradise Hotel uses a really good system for opening and closing things. If you pull a drawer out, once it gets past a certain point, the drawer will fully open, and if you push it closed past a certain point, it's fully closed. It works well and feels very polished, and it avoids situations where you're fighting with the game to try and do something simple, and the code for something like this is much simpler than trying to have realistic doors or drawers with full physics. These are just some of the details that the VR developers have to consider, but overall, a VR game is no different to a normal game. It needs to have a good flow and pacing, and as a general rule, you want to be introducing something new to the player about every 30 minutes, so whether it's a new location, new enemy type, or new weapon. This will keep the player engaged and make them feel like they're progressing rather than just doing the same thing over and over. We still get way too many VR games that feel like the tech demos with more sandbox do what you want design. This type of game isn't common in non-VR games for a reason. People want a reason to play a game. To wrap up this video, if a developer wants their game to succeed and sell well, they need a game that will catch their players' attention. It needs a unique selling point to make it stand out from the competition, and how the game looks to spectators can make a huge difference. The game itself needs to feel polished. You want to reduce friction from the player as much as possible. This is obviously all easier said than done, and making video games is one of the hardest things to try and do. Hopefully I can help. I've been studying game design, both VR and non-VR, for years, and I've decided to offer my services to other developers on a freelance basis. I know most developers probably think they know what's best for their own game, but having someone from outside who isn't so close to the project and has got a good eye for game design could be extremely valuable in my opinion. It could help keep things on track and make sure the game is going in the right direction. I want to keep things cheap, so my time is affordable even to small indie developers. I'm charging £120 per game consulting session, which I believe is around $150, and for that you get 3 hours playtest time with raw unedited video, and as I play the game I'll describe how I'm feeling in real time, as well as an edited shorter version highlighting all my findings, and I'll try to prioritise what I think is important versus a nice to have feature, and I'll include some possible fixes and solutions with examples on how it's been done in other games so that the developers have a reference point to look at. I'm happy to look at any project, whether it's early prototype, almost ready for release, or even released games where you want to try and improve your game with updates. I'm happy to sign any NDA, and discretion and confidentiality is obviously very important, especially for a game that's not released. I've added a developer tier to my Patreon, so you can subscribe to this and message me directly through Patreon, and obviously cancel whenever you like. Or you can email me directly, which I'll include my email address in the description, if you want to just make a one-off payment through Payoneer or something similar. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video if you made it this far. Hopefully someone found it useful or interesting, and as always, a massive thanks to my patrons and YouTube members who really helped me to continue making these videos and doing something that I love.